All right, guys, let's bring it back together and talk about the funnest part of the bill, which is budgets and the change to county and city budgets that are going to result. So Carrie kind of covered some of this earlier when we were talking about the mailing piece. For instance, the deadline for all local governments, we want to reiterate this so that nobody gets confused on it. You know, we've had 4 or 5 different budget deadlines for years and years and years. Now they're all going to be consolidated into one budget deadline, April 30th, for every single local government that submits a budget and levies a rate. April 30th is the deadline now. So make sure that you assimilate that into your calendars and into your processes. Again, the max levy process has been changed. Carrie says removed. I'm not going to bait and switch you like that. It's been changed and substantially modified, and we talked about that in the mailing process piece. But just the real piece there to know is that has to be done before budgets can be, before you can move into your formal budget process and budget approval process. Doesn't mean you can't be working on your budget the entire time before you do your mailing and hold your hearing. Just like in the past, you could work on any part of your budget you wanted to prior to doing your max levy. Same thing holds here. You can work on any part of it. You just can't set your hearing date or hold your hearing for your formal budget adoption, your full budget adoption, until you get that mailing notice done, the published notice of this new truth and taxation hearing, and the hearing held, right? There's no resolution to it anymore. You just have to hold the hearing, but you got to make sure that's done before you can move on with your formal adoption of budget process, starting with setting the hearing for the budget adoption. Schools are adjusted a little bit in what they can get on their levies. We'll cover this one first because it's easy. PEARL, which is the public education and recreation levy that schools have. It's used for a lot of adult education classes, English learner language, and a lot of playground equipment and recreation programming in schools. If a school does not currently have PEARL, they can no longer get it, right? It was a voted levy, and they had to vote it in place to have it, just a lot like voted PEPL. If they have not already done so, they no longer have the ability to do so. Any of your schools who do currently have PEARL, they already voted it in and they're already using it, can continue to do so. So they're grandfathered, and PEARL for them continues on as it always has. Okay? No change there. It's just nobody new can add to those roles. I think, what did John say? We have like 23 or 27. It's only a couple handfuls. So we have some 20-some schools that have that PEARL levy in place. So it's not that many, but we can't add anybody new. The big piece of this in terms of property taxes was the city and county piece, okay? Big changes happened in cities and counties. It applies to fiscal years 25, so the budget year coming, and all the way through FY28, and then there will be a change in 29 again if nothing else happens in terms of property taxes over that time frame. The changes are, we'll do cities here first, but there's analogous changes that Carrie alluded to earlier for counties. City changes are that a lot of the city general permissible levies, both voted and non-voted. So if you know your city budget forms, that front page, that property tax page, about half of that page will be consolidated together. Okay, so many of those city non-permissible or city non-voted and voted permissible levies will be rolled together along with the emergency levy and the 810 to create a consolidated general fund levy in years going forward. Okay, so we'll have multiple levies that'll be basically rolled into one. All of the levies that had a specific purpose that the money had to be protected and tracked for, those protections are gone. So the biggest one there is going to be supportive of local library. That's no longer protected money. They don't lose it right away because it becomes part of the calculation of the new rate. But the dollars are no longer protected for only use by the library. They become discretionary just like the 810, right? All of these dollars that get grouped together become $8, $10 allowed for any lawful purpose of the city, and they become discretionary at the direction of the council. It also provides a mechanism, like I stated there, that we reduce potentially the levy rate from year to year for cities for their consolidated general levy and for counties for their general basic and rural basic levies. Okay? The other levies that we don't mention here continue on as they always have. Right? So there will be certain levies, debt service being the most prominent of which, they continue on as they've always been. It's uncapped, it's necessary for the year, and all the same rules apply to it after this bill as did before. It's really the general levies that are being focused on by this bill. And the whole idea behind it was really to get especially in cities and in some counties where the general basic and the rural basic have been exceeded, it's to get them back to that cap of 350 and 395, or in a city to get the general fund levies back to a cap of 810. That was the stated intent of this mechanism going forward. Okay, cities, put on your auditor hat for a second, not your county budget hat. Here's all of the different city levies that'll roll together. Like I said, it is a solid half of that front property tax page for cities. So if it was a general permissible levy or a general permissible levy that was voted or non-voted, chances are it got rolled in. The only ones that escaped are the operation of a publicly owned transit, which is basically your DART tax, to 95 cents per thousand. That gets preserved and stays in its format. Aviation authority, since it is derived from an authority outside of the city's governance, that remains unchanged. Liability, property, and self-insurance remains unchanged. It's uncapped and it's usable for the same amount every year. Support of local emergency management and unified law both remain separate and distinct and in their original formats. But most of the other general fund levies and the emergency levy, which is a special revenue fund levy, are rolled in together into what we'll call the Consolidated General Fund Levy, or the CGFL. Okay, so that'll be for future years. You'll add our forms. I shouldn't say you. Our forms will add all of these together for a base year of 24, and then we'll make a calculation that we'll walk through here in a minute based on that number. But for going into 25, what our form will do and what we'll do at DOM, as we're tasked with doing this, is we'll add all of these levies together to get a base year rate and a base year request amount. Okay, so we'll start from whatever your FY24 request and rate were on these levies. That'll become the basis under which we calculate FY25. Okay, all right. So there is a mechanism that we'll have to do to calculate whether or not you're going to get ratcheted down, or there's guidelines for whether we have to do a calculation for you or not. The guidelines are pretty basic and pretty clear. The only thing that you have to focus on that's a little bit tricky is here we're talking about non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric. We're basing your growth on that number. So on a city budget, it's line 2A of your property tax page. Okay, so if your non-TIF regular taxable value growth with gas and electric goes up less than 3% from 24 to 25, there's no calculation that's made, no change change to your levy by calculation. You get to keep the same levy that you had in 24 into 25 for those general fund levies that get rolled together, okay? Or for your rural basic and your general basic. If you would grow less than 3%, you get to keep that same levy rate into 25 that you had in 24, okay? And then every year thereafter, we do a new calculation each year. So you may keep the same levy rate forever if you're a low-growth county or if you're a low-growth city, okay, until 29, which we'll talk about in a minute. If your non-TIF taxable value growth from 24 to 25 is over 3%, but less than 6%, so you're 3.01 to 5.99, we put a 2% limiter on your growth, and then we set a tax rate according to that. So this is not a 2% cap, right? So if at my current tax rate, or if my value went up 5.99% and I kept my current tax rate, I would increase my revenues 5.99%, right? Because my value went up, I didn't change my tax rate, I get more revenue on the same scale as my valuation increase. What this bill does and what our budget forms will do is it'll say, okay, you're between 3% and 6%, so we're going to put 2% limitation on you, and we'll essentially reduce that allowed maximum property tax revenue growth by 2% or around 2%. The math isn't quite exactly 2%. It'll be a little more, a little less, but we use 2% as our limiter. It's not a hard cap, it's a limitation. So if I was going to grow 5.99% in terms of requested revenue, I would instead grow 3.99%, or right around there. So it's a reduction, it's not a hard cap. Anybody over 6% in growth of non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric from 24 to 25 and then 25 to 26 and on, if they grow over 6% in regards to that, you get a 3% limiter put on you, okay? So it's a reduction of maximum allowed revenue. It's not a hard cap. I know some people have been treating it as a hard cap in the press and in conversation. It is not, it is a reduction. Like I said, there's a calculation that goes along with it. Here's the fun calculation for you. Do not worry about writing it down. We will make these slides available after, but we're going to step through it for a second so you understand how it's done. And our budget forms will do this entire calculation, not only for you, the county, but also for your cities, right? So you do not have to go through and meticulously hand check every single city calculation. Our system will do the calculation for them and provide them with their number right in the budget form, okay? But the calculation is, we take the current year requested dollars of all of those CGFL levies added together, we divide it by the current year non-TIF taxable with gas and electric multiplied by 1 plus your limiting factor. So if I had a limiting factor of 2%, it would be current year non-TIF taxable with gas and electric times 1.02, because I got a 2% limiter. If I'm under 3%, it's just times 1, because I don't have any limiter factor, okay? And then we take that, the outcome of that division problem, and we multiply it by 1,000 to get our adjusted consolidated general fund levy rate for FY25. Once we have that rate, we just multiply it in the normal taxing formula. We take the rate times the FY25 non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric divided by 1,000, and we come out with our adjusted consolidated rate, or consolidated general fund levy revenues. Okay, so down below is kind of an example of how this would work. So this particular city had when I add up all of their current FY24 CGFL levies together, I get 6.05. So this is a high growth city, they have a pretty low rate. So 6.05 is their CGFL all added together. That translates to little over $25 million in request, okay? Current year, FY24. Their current year non-TIF taxable is a little over $4 billion, $4.1 billion. So what we would do is we'd take that $25,099,099, we'd divide it by a calculation of the $4.1 billion times 1.03, because you can see over here their growth into the budget year non-TIF taxable. They're going from 4.1 to 4.4 billion in terms of non-TIF taxable value. That's a 7.9% increase. They're over 6%. They're in the 3% limiter. The 3% limiter stratum. So I apply 1.03 as my limiter. So I've got 25.099 million divided by 4.1 billion times 1.03. And I come out with an outcome out of that. When I multiply the outcome by 1,000, I get 5.87379 for my budget year CGFL rate max that they're allowed. They can be below that, but they can't go higher than 5.87. When I take that 5.87 and I multiply it against the 4.4 billion of budget year non-TIF taxable value, I get 26,293,591 as my new requested dollars for budget year 25 for this particular city. And that's a revenue growth from the previous year of 4.76%. So they're still growing, they're just not growing at the same rate that they would be if they hold their rate steady. Right? If they hold their 6.05 steady into FY25, they'd get 7.9% growth in revenue. This limits them down to 4.76% maximum. They could go less than that if they instead of wanting to do 5.87, if they want to go down to like $5 or $5.75 or $5.50, great, they can do that. They can't go higher than 5.87, and our budget forms will lock them into that number as their new rate cap for the CGFL, for the Consolidated General Fund Levy, okay? That's 1 year's worth of calculation. As you can see at the bottom there, mechanism applies FY25 through FY28 as it's currently constructed. So here's a multi-year example. Super fun math. So we start in FY24-25, and we'll just look at, I put in some growth assumptions just at random. This isn't based on anything. Just saying some years we're in, some years we're out. I want to show an example of how this could work. Okay, so each year is calculated on its own. The prior year doesn't influence it other than giving it the starting point. Okay, So each year we look, did you grow more or less than certain percentages in terms of non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric, right? So this city in the first year, they grew 7.5% in terms of non-TIF taxable value, so they get limited by 3%, and we have our calculation come out of that. They go from a 6.2 consolidated general fund levy to a 6.02 for the next year, for FY25, okay? You can see that that drops them from having requested, or that increases them, I should say, from having requested dollars of 29 million up to 30 million, so they still gain 1.2 million going from one year to the next. We then take that figure when we do our FY26 budget, we take FY25's calculated figures, and that becomes the basis of our FY26 calculation. So you can see the budget ACGFL rate and the budget consolidated general fund levy dollars go from the budget line to the current line for the next year, and we run the calculation again. Only this year, they only grew 2% in terms of non-TIF taxable value. So their limiter is 0. They get to keep the same rate in 26 as they had in 25, or they could go down. But they're not reduced by calculation any further, okay? In this instance, since this is a city and they're actually under the 810, this city would actually have the ability in this year, since they grew less than 3%, to go up to 810. That becomes kind of the hard cap at the end of this rainbow. I didn't do that here because it's so confusing already. I'm trying to not make you guys walk out in panic. But you can see each year there's a calculation that's done. So we can have years where we hit a calc and years where our calculation nets a 0 change, right, as far as rate. And then we apply that calculated rate, because the thing we're trying to figure out for the next year is what is their maximum general fund levy rate, or what is their maximum general basic rate, what is their maximum rural basic rate. That's what we're trying to get to, is the rate, and then we apply that rate like we would in any other scenario for property tax. We take the rate times their value for the next year divided by 1,000 to get to the dollars. And then the next year is its own calculation. So you can see 1 year we're in, 1 year we're out, the next year we're out, and then in the FY28 year, we're back in again because we had another boom to growth. So every year is calculated on its own. We run a calculation separate of the previous years for each new year. The forms will do this for you, but it's good to understand the math backing it, especially if you do the budget. If you're the part of the auditor's office that does the budget, you're going to want to understand how this calculation works so that you can make estimates for future years. Now, the kicker to this thing is it ends in 28. So the calculated general fund levy, the last year you'll have to deal with that under its current form in House File 718 is FY28. When FY29 rolls around, we do not any longer do the calculation to say, were you above, were you below, where were you in terms of value. You just get a hard cap placed on your rate at that point. For cities, it becomes an 810. So your CGFL max becomes 810 in FY29 if they don't change anything. So if I am a city and I started out at $12 per thousand on my CGFL and I only rolled down to 10 over 25 through 28, 29 rolls around, the final $2 gets chopped out from under me, and I go from $10 per thousand down to $8 per thousand, or $8.10 as my max. And that's what I'm allowed every year thereafter as a maximum, okay? No more calculation, hard cap. For counties, same thing happens. If you're starting out at like $4 per thousand on your general basic, and through all of the rollback mechanisms, you never really changed. You were under 3% every year in terms of growth. You went 0, 0, 0, so you've been at $4 per thousand that entire time. We come to 29, you go to $3.50, right? You get 50 cents chopped off your rate overnight, boom, okay? So part of that is I'm sure they're trying to force more action on further changes to property taxes down the road. The other part of that is it gets them back where the legislature stated they wanted to be, which is these hard caps of 810 and 350 and 395. Okay, so you've got to make sure that you're aware of that in coming years. If no action's taken, that's what's going to happen in FY29. And every year thereafter, you'll be under that hard cap. Okay? Okay, like I said, our forms will accommodate all of this math, and we will show it to you. We're not just going to ask you to take our word for it. We're going to make it so that you can verify what we do. Because honest to God, math is my weakest subject. It's a good thing I'm not in a job that requires any math. So we're going to set it up in the budget. I wish I were kidding with that. I took calculus in high school and college, but God knows I didn't pass with a great grade. So So we're going to show you the math kind of, and here's a mock-up. This is off of my old spreadsheet version of the budget. We have our IT working on this piece right now, getting it built into our system. So it will be ready day one when you guys have value in and we open the budget system for 25. It'll be there waiting. The minute you guys put in the taxable value, this will pop up for the city or for you as a county. Your number will show up automatically. It'll be there waiting for you. Your max. You'll be able to back it down, but you won't be able to take it up, okay? So our math is right there showing here's prior year, here's the budget year. You can follow the math through the same way I just showed you on the previous slide, and you'll get home. And then it'll automatically give you the amount that's max, and then they can fill it in down below where it says combined general fund levy. I'll have the cities fill that in by hand, and then we'll double check against it to make sure they're not violating their max. Okay, so all of that should be walled off for you as an auditor, both in terms of doing your own budget and in verifying and regulating the city budgets. We'll put as many guardrails in place to make sure this calculation is done correctly as possible, because it is a gnarly calculation in terms of the values. You have to have everything, the correct number in the correct spot, and it's a multi-tiered calculation. So it can be confusing, especially if you're a part-time city clerk. I mean, that's going to be a very hard calculation to do on your own. So we'll end up doing it for them. But double check our work, obviously, especially in the first year, because we're far from infallible. Carrie messes up all the time. I don't, but Carrie messes up all the time. Yeah.
Nick Manrique, Clinton County. The previous slide you had where you had like a 5-year estimation, is there any way you could share that with us, so that the Excel sheet with us?
And what I'm working on right now, this actually came out of, I'm building out a city version of this for like estimation. So it has a whole page where they can put in by class what their estimation of value growth is each year, and then it'll give you these outputs. So yes, we will eventually, at least for cities, I will eventually do that. Carrie, I would imagine, will do the same thing for counties. So yes, you'll have that estimator sheet. That was I didn't even do this for you guys. I was already working on the estimator sheet anyway because I was going to release that. But I'm like, hey, here's fun things for them to look at. Multi-year, everybody's happy. Yeah.
I assume you guys are doing training with the cities. What's the timeline? Oh, you're not.
Free for all.
Free?
It's a cage match. We're just going to throw them in and see what happens. No, we're going to do our normal.
Just a timeline.
Yeah, our normal budget. I'll be doing my normal budget training with the Iowa League of Cities. That is we always do 6 around the state. This year is going to be a little different, all right? Because this year, House File 718 touches everybody, whether you've been doing this for 50 years or you just started. So we're going to do it a little bit differently on the city side, where we will have 3 sessions of those 6 that will be for the beginners, only beginners. So the sites are Clear Lake, Cherokee, Cedar Rapids, West Des Moines, and, those are the 4 live ones. This year we're also going to do 2 virtual instead of 2 extra live ones to try to, because we want to get all the part-timers too, try to rope in everybody, because we have a lot of part-time clerks who have an actual job outside of being city clerk as well. They're moonlighting to be city clerk usually. So we're trying to rope in everybody. So we've got 2 virtual sessions, then we'll have advanced sessions in West Des Moines and in Cedar Rapids, beginner sessions in Cherokee and Clear Lake. Those will start November 3rd, I think. And it'll go, it's like November 3rd or 4th, and then the 4th or the 5th. They're one day and then the next day. Then we do a virtual week, and then we have the other 2 advanced sessions like that next week. And we're done with all of those before Thanksgiving. So we start beginning of November, and then we go through Thanksgiving. We'll have training sessions outside of that. I'm sure I'll have more webinars with the league. We've already had a couple. But we'll do more training sessions with the league for your cities. For your counties, I'm sure we'll have more programming coming up because we've still, as you heard with the questions earlier, we've still got things to hammer out. And as we hammer those things out, we will bring them to you, either through a webinar or through some sort of interaction. Okay, so there will be other training opportunities leading up to this. We're well aware of what a seismic change this is to the process. We're as nervous as you are, so we're going to try to help you as much as we can. We're literally in the exact same ship as you. So if you guys light your ship on fire, we get to drown with you. So we're highly motivated to make sure everything's done correctly. But we'll have training sessions, and we're going to be doing a work group again here. We're just kind of waiting on our IT to get some stuff done, and then we'll do another work group, and we'll have some more answers out of that we'll be able to spread around, okay? Carrie can talk about some finer points on the county piece. That's the city piece. The county piece is virtually the same, only it affects your general basic and your rural basic separately, 2 calculations instead of the 1. Cities get off light. They have to do 1 for their consolidated general. We just jammed all of theirs together. You guys maintain rural basic separate of general basic, so there's 2 calculations to go over. So I'll turn it over to Carrie to go through those.
Bring this back down. Okay, yes, so let's talk about the county budget. One of the things it also does is moving forward, beginning with your fiscal '25 budgets, a number of counties have used that opportunity to exceed the general basic and rural basic by publishing the extra notice. Number of folks have done that. That's not going to be something that you can now initiate. So if you've never done this before, and in '25 you want to exceed that general basic or rural basic, you can no longer do that by just publishing an extra notice. They did retain the piece of statute that allows you to exceed via an election, so that still is in there as an option, but there's some real specific language in there. It does limit the length of how long that can take place, so there's just some things involved in it. If you're going to newly exceed the limits moving forward, so keep that in mind. The 350 and 395 are still there, but as Ted mentioned, they still have a presence, our old levy limits, but in reality, what we're doing is calculating for each and every city or each and every county their new levy limit rate. So everyone's levy limit rate, for the most part, is going to be calculated for them based on their own experience, right? So some county is going to have a $4 general basic rate. Some county is going to have a, $3 and, 10-cent levy limit rate. So it all sort of depends on your individual circumstances related to your valuation growth. It does allow, so if you were one of those that have exceeded the 350 or 395, it does include that in your base, so that is calculated as part of your prior year basic rate, and it's built in, so it's not dropping you back to 350 and doing the calculation. So and again, with this, it's very similar as far as what the limiters are to what cities are. It's the same basic concept. Your levy rate is reduced if the non-TIF taxable growth triggers are met or exceeded. So again, if you see a growth in your non-TIF taxable from the prior year under 3%, then we really don't make any reduction to your rate. Your rate is what it is from the prior year. If you're over 3% but less than 6%, it's a 2% reduction factor. And then if you're over 6%, then there's a 3% reduction factor that's applied to arrive at a new rate specific to your circumstances. So as Ted mentioned, we're going to provide this information for you. This form, this is sort of what you're going to see on top of your property tax page of your county budget forms. So with you guys, there was no real consolidation of rates, right? We're really just taking a look at your general basic and rural basic rates. Your supplemental rates are still what they are. There is no modification to those supplemental rates. Your debt service is what it is. If you had unified law, that is what it is. So those were not modified. We're really just looking at general basic, rural basic, and there was no consolidation like we saw with the cities. But there does need to be, as Ted mentioned, this separate calculation based on your general basic growth, that taxable growth that your general basic rate applies to, and then the taxable growth in your rural value that your rural basic rate would apply to. So this information, again, will be all populated for you with your new maximums for those particular rates. And then you will actually obviously choose, are you using that maximum rate, or are you doing something lower? And if you try to exceed it, then our budget forms will provide you with an error. So that's sort of our check to make sure that you're not exceeding what the statute requires. And so this is just an example, and I showed it already. This is an example of what your extra notice of budget, that first hearing notice will look like. And let's walk through. This is an actual example with one of my county friends. I sent this to them, and they're like, oh, what is this, right? Okay, so this is an example of a rural county that's been exceeding in their general basic, right? So number of years have been exceeding the 350 in their general basic. So for the purposes of this example, I'm using fiscal 23 actual numbers and then fiscal 24 values to sort of serve as an example or a stand-in for what we'll actually be using for 24 and 25. So this county had in this year been levying their general basic rate of $4.50. So they've been exceeding, right? That generated about $1.8 million for their general basic. So, okay, that's what's happened. Then let's take a look at the value. They did have, in the prior year, current year, $415 million in value. And if we look at, in the budget year, what they have, it grew to $418 some in value. Again, non-TIF taxable, because it's what that general basic rate will apply to, so non-TIF taxable with gas and electric. So that resulted in a 1% taxable growth. So for this county, there is no limiter, right? They still have that $4.50 rate. Now, they can't have a $4.60 rate, but they still are allowed to retain their $4.50 rate. And then that would generate for them about $1.8 million, and that's a revenue growth of a little over 1%. So that's an example where they're exceeding, but their growth factor is very low. So they're retaining that exceed rate that they had, and just basically, seeing the growth on the value as their revenue growth. So in this same county, their rural basic rate is actually under the maximum. So it's $2.73. So they are not levying the max on their rural basic rate. That generated about $933,000. Their taxable value was $341 in the current year. And then when we look at the budget year, it grew to $349. That's about a 2% growth. So again, they're under 3% in their growth, so they are not limited by this limiting factor. So their rural basic rate, if we look at them remaining the same, it would be $2.73. But as we talked about before, and Ted showed you that example, since they're actually less than $3.95 and they're not limited, they could go up to $3.95. So.
Correct. Well, that'd become your base.
Yeah, again, yep,
So if you have 1 year with under 3%, you can max it up or go up to the max, the 395.
if you're under,
And then that would
yeah.
establish that as the new calculation point for the years after that.
If you're willing to absorb that kind of tax increase.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, it's all, I mean, there's policy implications too,
Sorry,
right?
which county was that again? not Polk County, that's the important thing, right?
Right. So, and I mean, you'd kind of have to look at your own history, like what is your value traditionally been doing? I know I was talking to someone that said, they're going to have a very large, project come on the tax base. So depending on how large it is in relation to your overall tax base, you could see a big whoop in your value growth. Or you could see a decrease if somebody was pulling
The reason I
TIF.
ask is we had someone this morning that said that they're at 165 in the rural because they're supplementing that significantly with sales tax,
Oh,
which
sure.
is what we are. But there's already talk about next year modifying sales tax, local option sales tax. So all of a sudden, we could have that be changed. And so I'm wondering, where we're going to come up with that extra money? Because if we're in the over 3%, but they've changed our sales tax, we wouldn't be able to make the budget on that limited factor then. So hopefully they take that into consideration, ISAC representatives, that if they're going to change the sales tax, they need to give us the authority to at least make that up somehow. That is all accurate.
Yep. All good questions for policymakers. Okay, so that's an example of a county with low growth, right? And some folks are in that boat, and some folks are in the other boat. So let's look at an example of somebody that's more of a higher growth situation. So in this case, it's a county levying 350, generating about 3.6 million. Their non-TIF taxable is 103. In the budget year, it grew to 109, actually, over a 6% growth, right? So they experienced over 6% growth. So their limiter would be 3%, right? So we're going to chop off 3% of that ability to grow, essentially. And we're going to reflect that in a calculation that arrives at a new rate. So their rate would then go down to $3.39. So that would be their max rate, max dollars. Again, that resulted in a revenue growth of a little over 3%. So if they had, like Ted said, kept their $3.50 rate and just kept that the same, applied that to their new taxable value, they would have seen an over 6% growth in their revenue. But with this limiter now, that was pulled down by 3%, and their revenue growth, their tax dollar revenue growth, is a little over 3% instead. In this instance, then, they have a rule rate of $2.60. Again, we look at their max dollars and their taxable growth. Taxable went from 736 to 781, again, about a 6% growth. They're in that top tier of the limitation, so we're going to lop off 3% of what they're able to grow, and then we'll back into a new rate that would then be applied, and that rate would go down to $2.52. And again, resulting in a revenue growth of a little over 3%. So you can kind of see that's how the mechanism would work. It's very different depending on your individual circumstances, right? Like, are you at the maximum? What is your growth like year to year? Are you at the maximum for your rural basic? Is your rural really growing, but your overall not necessarily growing, or vice versa? So there's a lot of differential impacts depending on your individual circumstances. Yeah.
Hi, Betty Ellis from Wright County.
Hi.
In Ted's presentation with the cities, he had it in the next 4-5 years.
Yeah.
And then if they were still over, like your previous slide was 450, low growth, they stayed at 450. Year 5 or 6, I don't remember what it was.
Oh, 29.
Is that going to have to be 350 for the counties?
Yep. So in 29, everyone would go to 350 as a max. So if you had been exceeding for several years, you'd drop down to 350. If you're like Dallas County that's been under, you'd be able to go up to 350. Whereas before, if you were growing, then you would have been limited.
Yeah,
But
so-
that limiting factor no longer comes into play with 29. 29, it's just 350, 395. Well, right, and I think that's part of it. I think there is an inclination that they would like to bring everybody back to the table before they get to fiscal 29.
So that's exactly, I was actually going to say the same thing that Betty did. That was my county. And we
Yes.
rarely have growth over 3%. So we could continually stay at 450, but we don't want to do that because then in the last year we will have to drop a whole dollar, and that's a significant amount of our budget. So I just want to make sure people understand that just because you get to stay at that limit or that levy limit, that doesn't necessarily mean a good thing, because then you'll have to drop more all at once. So just be thinking down the road as you budget if you're in that situation with low growth. So
Maybe. And there's one other thing I was going to say. Oh, and I know one question that came into play before, and I don't know if this is, I just want to say it when folks are in the room. So, you know, say you can only use your, you know, your general supplemental if you're at your levy limit. So if in this case, your max rate is $3.39, which is not $3.50, but that's still your max. So you could use a general supplemental. Do you see what I mean there?
Yeah, and that applies to cities as well, because for certain levies like the FICA and IPERS levy, you have to be in a city at your 810 max under current law to use that. Each city will have its own max. Each
Right.
county will have its own max now. It won't be 810, it'll be 620 or whatever it calculates to.
Right.
And as long as they're at 620, they can then use FICA and IPERS. County, same thing. If you're at your, you know,
Your max.
250 or whatever it is,
Right.
you get to then use your supplemental because you're at your individual max. That's
Right.
the key point.
Yeah. And I know that came up early on, and maybe everybody already knows that, but I just wanted to put that reminder out there. And then Ted wants to talk
No, I
about
don't.
TIF.
Nope, I don't.
Ted wants to talk about TIF. And
I'm gonna.
We'll just let him do
So
that.
I'll bring up something about TIF that it's been a constant question since this started. The growth calculation is focused on non-TIF taxable value. There's a couple different ways that non-TIF taxable value could grow. Number one is through natural growth. You got more property, right? Or your property valued higher. You got natural growth. The other way is you had a bunch of value tied up in TIF, generating TIF revenue. That's done, and it rolls off of TIF back into the general pop, and it becomes part of your non-TIF taxable value. That drives that up. You're going to have growth. I tell you this to say, look at this long term. I'm not saying manipulate your TIF. In fact, I'm specifically saying do not manipulate your TIF just based on your desire for rate. But watch it, because if you have stuff rolling off, that's going to affect this calculation, and you just need to figure that into your long-term planning, okay? So you're going to have to be very, very considerate in future years about when TIF rolls off, and you want to be tracking those for counties that use TIF, and this is something I will be imparting to cities specifically, is you really want to be tracking your end dates very closely of your debts, not only your debts, but also your TIF ordinance areas that are coming to statutory sunset, because that will change that balance of non-TIF to TIF value, and that will drive this calculation higher or lower based on if you're taking more or less. I say that again, just for long-term planning, do not manipulate your TIF to get a desired rate. You still have to have legitimate TIF debt to create TIF, okay?
What about those cities that sometimes don't know what they're doing and
They don't
ask
exist.
for their max, and then the next year they drop down to
Right.
zero? And
That's
Well,
why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, the volatility
Yeah.
is difficult to plan for, right? And obviously, you guys will be impacted by what happens with TIF usage within your county. I mean, you have more value to sort of absorb that than, say, a little city that, you know, based on their own TIF usage, they might be really, and that's why, like Ted said, he's talking to folks about
It's a
it.
dangerous, I'm on a knife edge here. I want to talk about it and I don't want to talk about it. 'Cause
Right.
If I talk about it, people get bad ideas. If I don't talk about it, you're going to have some tiny town who's 96% in an urban renewal area, and they're TIFing the whole thing, and one year they max it out, and the next year they flatline it, and their
Yeah.
tax revenue is going to go crazy
Yeah,
rather than being smooth and thoughtful about it. So
Right.
I will be bringing that same message to cities, but you, as another kind of spoke in the TIF wheel, can help with the logic of this. You know, as you're getting asked, you're going to get asked questions because you're part of the TIF process. Like, you're going to get this question potentially. So I want you to be prepared for it. But please, no bad ideas here. Do not make me regret talking about TIF, okay? Because it's going to be a huge change, a huge factor, especially if you have TIF rolling off and going into non-TIF value. It'll be a huge factor in these calculations and can swing your rate one way or the other.
Right.
Other questions? You'll continue to hear more from us about this, as Ted mentioned. More as our budget software gets finalized, we'll have even more to show you, however, I'll work with ISACA and, how do we want to best present this information to county auditors? I'll work with you guys and we'll figure it out. Yeah,
Can you go back to that last slide?
this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm kind of thinking through how this would work. The growth limitation is on the valuation.
Yeah. That's what determines the growth limiter. Yep, your
Okay.
valuation growth.
Right, right,
Yep.
right. So as we budget, I'm thinking we'll get first of all, we should get our last year's valuation and now our new valuation, find out what that change was. And if the change is more than 3%, then we'll know if we're safe, if we even have to worry about that limitation.
Well, you won't know the value yet that's going to be used. I mean, if you're
This is taxable value, remember, so you got to wait till rollback is out.
got to wait till rollback
Okay,
and,
yeah. Right, go through all that process.
Yeah,
and-
yeah, yeah.
okay.
Once you've went through that whole process and you're submitting values, then, once you submit values, it'll be populated into our sheet. But yeah, as soon as, you got to do TIP, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
there's so many things that happen to arrive at that
But-
taxable value.
So when we get to that point, then if we're trying to, for example, we have a lot of capital projects we could be doing, so we could tax as much as possible and use it. But if we decide to hold off on some of those, then maybe as we budget, looking at long-term, the whole 5 years, if we want to end up where we're using the I guess my question is, say we don't need to levy at 3.5 for whatever reason. If we would drop that down, or maybe I should be talking about the rural, like the 3.95. If I drop that down at some point to 3.8, will that levy rate then be stuck at that place? Does that make sense?
Right, so so you dropped it to 3.8,
Right.
and the next year you had no growth, you'd be at 3.8.
So then so we should figure out a way to spend enough money.
I'm not going
to-
to tell you that.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Thank
No,
you.
I mean,
inside.
just, you're gonna have to just look at, this is all individualized, look at your history with taxable growth.
Yep, and in that situation, another thing to factor in is in FY29, let's say you're at 3.8 the entire way through.
Yeah.
FY29, you got to go back up to 395 if you want to. The
Right.
point that was made over here, you then get that unleashed to go back up to what is now the hard cap, okay? But you can. So like in the example I had for cities, they were way down at like 6.05 and they ended up at like 5.87. In FY29, could you go back to that slide?
Yeah.
The 5-year. I showed in FY29 them bumping up to 810 and saying, all right, we're sick of this 5.8 stuff. Let's go up to 810 because legally they'd have the right to do that. But look at what happens. They go up 42% in terms of value. The percentage at the bottom is wrong. It's actually like 42.3%. But they go up $14 million in 1 year. So you can do that, but there's going to be consequences of that kind of a tax increase. So kind of thinking through a smooth policy might not be a bad idea, but it's not mandated in any way.
Right, ultimately, we will tell you what your max is, and you can do that max or something less. Again, that's a local decision at that point.
I just wanted to mention, I've had some cities starting to ask me, hey, what's my values? I need to start
Yeah,
planning.
yeah.
I'm like, well, you can ask your assessor for your assessed values, because I don't know the rollback.
Right,
I don't have the values reconciled from the assessor, so
you don't know
they
TIF,
are
it's
getting
all-
anxious. So I just wanted to make sure everybody was
We
kind
have
of,
been quite clear that we will not know anything until until November at the very
Right,
earliest.
because the TIF plays a big part in it.
I mean,
Yeah.
right, January 1 is when we know,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and rollback's not out until end of October.
End of October.
Statutorily.
Yeah.
So we can't possibly know anything until then. The only thing we would know is, did we have a giant jump in assessed values? But even that doesn't matter because rollback's a statewide number. So until we get all of the counties added together, we have no idea what rollback's gonna be.
And, you know, that giant jump in value may be pulled for TIF.
It could be, yeah. It
So-
absolutely could be pulled out of it and it could be in TIF.
Yeah.
So we are giving the same message of like, you're gonna have to cool down and wait and get your TIF stuff in as fast as humanly possible, cities, because the quicker your TIF is in, the quicker your values get calculated and thrown into our system. So it has given me a nice thing to hit them over the head with TIF again, so that's fun.
End of day question, just because I have myself a little confused. The topic is use of supplemental levies, general or rural basic.
Yeah.
My confusion, I got myself turned around on, are they coupled to using the max, being at your max? 350, 343, whatever it is, as long as you're at your max, or 395, or whatever do you have to be at your max to use the supplemental levy?
Yes, your individual max. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, no one else is going to ask, so I want to know,
What?
on the first public hearing, are the county auditors responsible for collecting proof of publication?
Okay, so the question is here. My mic is dead.
Oh, step over here then.
Yeah, there we go, hang on.
Yeah, I'll just.
I got loosened. Okay, there we go. Okay, mic's on now. So the question is for that published notice that you have to have for the truth and taxation hearing, the not max levy hearing. That notice, is there a responsibility on the county auditor's office to collect that notice? I am strongly in the yes camp because 384.16 says they cannot do the rest of the city's process until that notice has been issued and they've held their hearing and all of that stuff. So I believe yes. That being said, I will look through it again because I've been wrong before. I will be wrong again. But when it's Jared, I'll pretend to be right and I'll argue to the death. No, I think yes.
And that's what my thought was as well.
Yeah. I don't see any way around it. It would be lovely if you didn't have another task on your plate, but I think just like max levy, it's going to be very similar.
Sure.
You have to check it. The only thing is, you won't necessarily. You'll have to check like did they do their setting of hearing after that hearing date? You know, there's no resolution component anymore, but everything else should be very similar.
Okay.
And I would say too, this process will be totally new for schools. Like they haven't
Yeah.
had to do, they didn't have to do max levy, so.
That's where your big problem is going to be. They've never done anything like this.
They've
You may have
never,
to-
yeah,
you
they've
may have
never
to
done
hold their
anything
hand.
like this. And, their rate and their taxes get kind of messed with because of the school formula.
Yeah.
So
At the end of the process, it's going to be weird.
there's some, yeah, anyway, so
Be prepared
it's
for a lot
new
of
for
questions.
them.
Yeah, be
It's
prepared
new
for a lot of
them.
questions.
They are, it's professional staff doing it, so that should help, but, and they'll get tons of training, but I'm just saying, that's totally new for them.
I think he has a follow-up.
Oh, you,
Well, out
I
of
suppose.
morbid curiosity,
That's a good start.
no.
since we were talking about geodebt issuance,
Oh, boy.
do you have any idea if 76.2 is going to be changed for the filing deadlines based off the fact that budgets are all now due April 30th?
It has not yet been changed, but that is another thing to put in our
Oh.
list of grievances that we can get in a cleanup bill. To move, you're talking about moving that back a little bit, because 76.2, I know you guys all know this, but I'll go over it for my own edification. So 76.2 states that you have to have, if you are a city or a county or a school, and you want to issue new debt in the next year, but you don't have that debt done at the time of budget being due. So it used to be March 31st. If a city didn't have it done, they could still add it on if they got it in sundry days, after that.
April 14th.
Thank you. I'm forgetting. I was going to say April 15th, but I knew that was wrong. It's the day before. Before April 15th is the way it's worded. Thank you. That is still the same. So now that ability is basically gone, and they have to have it done before their budget is due. So that's something that they could look at. They did not make a change to that, but it's something we can point out if it's important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's still plenty of time. I mean, they should have no trouble with this.
Oh, no, Mike.
They should have no.
Should.
They should have.
But have you
They should have no trouble with this.
met some
But
of my cities?
inevitably, somebody will.
Mike's rolling in with a question.
Why would we want to promote extending that date? Leave it
I'm
alone.
gonna make trouble for Polk County specifically. I'm an agent of chaos like the Joker. So, no, I agree. I think April 14th, because it's before April 15th, I think that's sufficient time. But they're looking at a lot of this stuff that kind of didn't follow along the first time. So if that gets changed, don't be surprised. But for right now, it remains the same. April 14th is the last day they can get that post-certification debt in. Any other questions?
Daryl brained it now.
All right. We will hang around if you need a confessional style
everyone.
question.
Yeah.
You don't want anybody